At Ravenfield Air Base, young airman Ethan Ward mocks a quiet, scarred lieutenant named Natalie Cross, unaware she's a legend. Known only in whispers as Ghost Hawk, Cross led a near-impossible classified mission that saved lives but left her presumed dead. When a four-star general unexpectedly salutes her in front of everyone, Ethan's world cracks open. His arrogance fades, replaced by shame and a newfound respect. The woman he ridiculed is a war hero hiding in plain sight, teaching him what true strength looks like. Silent, humble, earned. From that moment on, nothing at the base or in Ethan's heart stays the same. If this story opened your eyes to quiet strength and unseen sacrifice, show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep honoring the unsung heroes among us, because sometimes the loudest courage is the one that whispers. Hey, Cross, those scars, what? You lose a fight with a toolbox, or did your pen explode on you? The voices of the young privates rang out across the hangar, mocking and hungry for laughter, their words laced with the sharpness of immaturity. But Lieutenant Natalie Cross didn't even blink. She didn't glance their way, didn't tighten her jaw, didn't shift her stance. Her eyes stayed locked on the checklist in her grip, her scarred forearms moving with quiet, fluid precision, each checkmark deliberate and unbothered, as if their taunts hadn't even brushed the edge of her awareness. And then, the mood shifted. Fast and absolute. The moment General Bradford entered, the noise collapsed into silence like air sucked from the room. The man was a legend in his own right, a combat veteran who had led thousands through hell and back. His boots barely echoed against the floor before he froze in place at the sight of her. Without hesitation, he brought his hand up in a crisp salute. First. That was the moment everything clicked into place for Ward. The smug grin faded from his face. He had mocked someone he didn't understand, someone whose quiet reputation carried more weight than he could yet comprehend. He'd laughed at a legend who walked among them without ever needing to say a word. Ravenfield Air Base greeted the rising sun like it always did, with a low murmur that built steadily into the thunder of a new day. The air hung thick with the ghostly scent of jet fuel, a residue of yesterday's sorties, mixed with the sharp tang of hydraulic fluid and the ever-present hint of scorched metal. Inside the sprawling maintenance hangar, life pulsed in a controlled chaos. The clang of dropped tools, the rhythmic drone of engines, the sharp hiss of compressors, and the voices of crew members calling over the mechanical din. Everything in this space had purpose. Every stain on the concrete floor, every dent in the wall, every echo in the air spoke of aircraft saved, missions prepped, and moments of war lived in steel and sweat. Within that rhythm, moving with the grace and surety of someone born into it, was Lieutenant Natalie Cross. She wasn't hurried, wasn't sluggish. Her every step measured, deliberate. Clipboard in hand, she moved between aircraft like a conductor guiding a mechanical symphony. Her dark hair was tied back tightly, not a single strand left to chance. Her uniform, perfect, crisp, immaculate, as disciplined as the woman wearing it. But it wasn't her walk or her checklist or her commands that drew the eye. It was her forearms, if anyone dared to look. Jagged, unmistakable scars snaked from her wrists to her elbows, thin lightning bolts etched into skin. The older NCOs knew better than to stare. Whether out of respect, discipline, or long-earned wisdom, they knew what those marks meant. The fresh recruits, though, couldn't help themselves. They noticed. They always noticed. But Cross gave them nothing, no reaction, no hint that she had even heard the whispers or caught the sideways glances. Her focus never wavered. Calm, steady, unshaken. She moved through the hangar as if the chatter around her were no more than wind brushing past steel. And yet, there was something undeniable about her. A presence that didn't ask for respect but still claimed it. She didn't raise her voice, didn't bark orders. She didn't have to. The seasoned techs, the ones who had been working these birds longer than most recruits had been alive, nodded as she passed. A shared glance, a quiet moment of recognition. They knew what she was. They didn't need to be told. The younger ones, though, the wards of the world, saw what they thought they saw. A mystery, a curiosity, maybe a warning, maybe a victim. Maybe just someone with visible marks that made her an easy punchline. But scars don't always tell the story people expect. Sometimes they're not signs of weakness, but proof of survival. Markers that someone faced something brutal, something that should have broken them, and walked through it anyway. Sometimes the ones carrying the deepest scars are the ones you ought to study, to follow, to respect, even if they never say a word. Natalie Cross didn't need to wear her past like a banner. She didn't use those scars to defend herself or to demand reverence. They weren't for show. They were simply part of her, as real and vital as the hands that signed off on repairs, or the sharp mind that never missed a fault in a torque reading. She was the checklist, the standard, the kind of leader who didn't have to remind you of her authority because the room already knew. The miscalibrated sensor was easy to spot, at least for those who knew what they were looking at. Every now and then, a young airman or fresh recruit would steal a glance her way. And like clockwork, a seasoned sergeant would follow that glance with one of their own. A look that said, "Think twice." More often than not, that glance was all it took. The veterans had seen enough to understand. Lieutenant Natalie Cross had earned her place in that hangar. The ghosts that filled the maintenance bay weren't just the echoes of long-gone engines or the sharp sting of fuel in the air. Some ghosts had breath in their lungs and grease on their hands. They didn't ask for attention, but they carried weight, the kind only time and trial could forge. Cross was one of those. Quiet, precise, always present. She moved with the same calm certainty as the rising sun, passing unnoticed by those too young or too arrogant to see past the surface. But for those who mattered, the ones with lines on their faces and stories in their eyes, she was known, deeply. At night, Ethan Ward would lie in his bunk and tell himself that he belonged, that he was the best of the best. It was easier that way. He'd been top of his class, or so he liked to remind himself while staring at the cracked ceiling above his shared barracks room. He'd crushed every written exam, outpaced his peers in the physical drills, committed every regulation to memory as if his career hinged on it. On paper, he was the ideal soldier, sharp, confident, reliable. But paper didn't show the cracks beneath the surface. It didn't capture the flicker of doubt that crept in whenever he watched the older techs work with effortless precision, as if their tools were just extensions of their own bodies. Paper didn't show the tightness in his chest or the whisper in his mind, the fear that he was a fraud, and worse, that everyone else might see it too. So Ethan performed. Like so many others trying to outrun their own uncertainty, he got loud. From his very first day at Ravenfield Air Base, he made sure he was the one talking the most, laughing the hardest, always a wisecrack at the ready. He needed to control the narrative, to be the one who held the room. And when he came across someone like Cross, someone who didn't fit the mold, he made her his target. Lieutenant Cross, with her quiet composure and the scars that trailed up her arms, unsettled him. She didn't chase attention, didn't flinch at being overlooked. And that was the problem. Ethan didn't understand her, and what he didn't understand, he feared. Rather than question why the seasoned NCOs gave her small, silent nods when they passed, subtle acknowledgments earned, not given, he mocked her. It was easier. "Hey, Cross, those scars from losing a fight with a toolbox. Or did your pen explode on you?" he'd said one morning, tossing the words out with a smirk, his voice pitched for maximum effect. The laughter came right on cue from the other privates, and for a fleeting moment, he felt weightless. It wasn't that he hated her. Not really. It was that, in those moments, she became the spotlight, and he could hide behind it. To him, her silence seemed like weakness, but somewhere deep down, he knew better. He saw it in glimpses, the glances exchanged behind his back, the kind of respect she commanded without saying a word. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was real, and it gnawed at something inside him, because if she had earned all that simply by being steady, by surviving things that left marks he couldn't begin to understand, then what did that make him? The one who demanded respect through volume and jokes? Ethan's arrogance was armor, his mockery, a defense. It was safer to tear down what confused him than admit that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't figured it all out yet. It was easier to focus on the scars he could see than to face the invisible battles inside himself, the ones he hadn't fought yet, the ones he didn't know how to win. And the truth was, he wasn't the only one. Across the base, there were countless others like him. Young, uncertain, terrified of not being enough. They filled their fear with noise. They mistook volume for strength. And they didn't yet understand that the strongest people were often the ones who never needed to raise their voice. He had mistaken judgment for confidence. Every time Natalie refused to take the bait, offering no retort to his sharp jabs, it threw Ethan off balance. Back then, he didn't have the awareness to recognize it, but her silence echoed louder than any comeback could have. His words, however cutting he thought them to be, slid right off her, ineffective against that quiet strength she carried like armor. And the more she stayed calm, the more exposed he felt. Like each second she didn't flinch, didn't answer, deepened the fractures in his own fragile ego. Later, alone in his bunk where no one could see the doubts creeping in, Ethan would lie awake, staring at the metal ceiling above. He would replay her stillness in his mind, how her eyes, when they occasionally turned to meet his, seemed to cut through every layer he hid behind. He thought of the scars he had mocked, thinking them weaknesses to exploit. Now he began to realize they weren't shameful at all. They were proof of resilience, of pain endured, of stories he had no right to mock and no experience to understand. But when daylight returned and he found himself back in the hangar, surrounded by the jeers and smirks of his peers, he tucked those nighttime truths away. He picked arrogance again. It was easier. It let him mask the fear that Natalie Cross didn't just unsettle him. She outright intimidated him, and not with bluster or rank, but with something far more unnerving. Her composure, her skill, and her quiet, unwavering dignity. He couldn't face that truth yet. So he smirked, and he mocked, and he hid. By mid-morning, the sun had already begun to bake the maintenance bay, thickening the already pungent mix of oil, jet fuel, and scorched metal. Work carried on like usual, tools clanging, engines whining through tests, NCOs shouting commands above the noise. Ethan Ward leaned against a crate, smug from his latest dig at Lieutenant Cross. That smug little grin tugged at his lips while his buddies hung on, eyes eager for another performance. But Natalie remained unshaken, as always. She moved with the steady focus of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, checking off items from her clipboard, cross-verifying inventory, nodding curtly to the NCOs who addressed her with a deference that always made Ethan bristle, though he never quite admitted why. And then something shifted. It started small, barely noticeable. The chatter near the bay doors began to dwindle, then dropped to nothing. Even the light-hearted laughter disappeared. Conversations died mid-sentence. The shuffle of boots on concrete replaced it. Slow, deliberate footsteps. A wave of awareness moved through the room like electricity. Techs and mechanics stiffened where they stood. Backs straightened, heads turned, and Ethan, still caught in the last moment of his swagger, looked over, irritated that his crowd had lost interest. Then he saw the reason. General Bradford. There was no need for an introduction. The moment he appeared, the air in the bay thickened. The man's presence sucked up all the oxygen. Tall and broad-shouldered, he strode in like a force of nature. His uniform was flawless, his boots so polished they reflected the overhead lights despite the grit on the floor. Medals and stars spanned his chest, too many for Ethan to count in the moment. His face bore the weight of decades, creased from years of high-stakes decisions made behind war room doors and in the chaos of battlefield command. Every pair of eyes followed him as he moved, not hurried but steady, each step deliberate, like he was pacing through a battlefield, not a hangar. His gaze swept across the space, pausing here and there on machinery, aircraft, crews, NCOs. The energy in the room dropped to a hush. Even the background hum of engines seemed to quiet itself in deference. Ethan snapped to attention, his spine locking tight. He'd seen generals before, during formal events, parades, distant and untouchable. But never like this. Never right here, in the middle of their world, where sweat and labor met steel and discipline. And then the general's eyes found Natalie Cross. He stopped cold. The shift was slight, but unmistakable. His carefully composed expression faltered for the briefest instant. His eyes widened, his brow eased, and a flicker of recognition lit up his face. Something unspoken passed between them, something no one else in the hangar could begin to interpret. The silence, already thick, became suffocating. And then, in a move that stunned every witness into absolute stillness, General Bradford raised his hand to salute her, here Simone. Not a nod, not a dismissive gesture of courtesy. A full salute, sharp, exact, respectful in a way that made even the senior NCOs pause. The room didn't just quiet, it froze, and Ethan, his smirk vanished. His blood ran cold. Because in that moment, as the most decorated man any of them had ever seen stood saluting the woman Ethan had been mocking just minutes earlier, the truth hit with crushing clarity. Natalie Cross wasn't just competent. She was someone. The gaps in the enemy's patrol routes, the one who kept the team moving when exhaustion threatened to shatter them. When comms went down and satellite uplinks failed, it was Cross who made the call to press forward rather than pull out. Her voice, quiet and unwavering, held them together like steel thread. They reached the complex after 4 nights of movement, slipping in beneath the radar, beneath notice, ghosts in the storm. Cross and her team breached the outer perimeter silently. They moved like whispers through shadows, disabling sentries with brutal precision. Every movement had a purpose. Every second was counted. The hostages were held underground, beneath layers of reinforced steel and guarded checkpoints. Cross took point, neutralizing threats, making every shot count. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. She couldn't afford to. They found the hostages huddled in a dark chamber, frightened, hungry, some wounded. Cross knelt beside a boy no older than 10 and gave him her own rations, then lifted an injured woman onto her back without a second thought. They hadn't been ordered to carry anyone, but leaving them behind wasn't an option. Not for her. The exfiltration was worse than the insertion. Enemy forces had realized something was wrong, and alarms were sounding like distant thunder rolling through the canyons. Cross led them through a minefield, her memory guiding each careful step, then into a ravine choked with fog and smoke. They were being hunted, outnumbered, outgunned. But they kept moving. She kept them moving. By the time the evac choppers found them, 2 team members had been lost. Cross didn't speak during the flight back. She just sat at the edge of the ramp, blood drying on her uniform, eyes locked on the horizon. The mission had succeeded. The grid was down. The hostages were safe. But the cost was etched into her every scar. And then it was over. No medals, no press, no mention in debriefs. Operation Iron Veil vanished into classified archives. Its survivors scattered, sworn to silence. But the name Ghost Hawk lived on in whispers. It meant something to those who'd served long enough to hear it. It meant sacrifice. It meant the impossible had been done and done without fanfare. Now, years later, in the middle of a maintenance base surrounded by skeptical recruits and seasoned veterans alike, that name was no longer myth. It was standing right there, embodied in a woman they'd all underestimated. Natalie Cross, lieutenant now. But once, Ghost Hawk. Ethan Ward couldn't look at her the same. He couldn't look at himself the same. Every snide remark he'd made, every sideways glance felt like a stain he couldn't scrub out. He'd laughed at her scars, not realizing they were the price of courage few dared to imagine. He'd judged her from behind a clean uniform and a smug smile. And now, faced with the truth, all of that collapsed into dust. She hadn't needed to defend herself. She hadn't said a word. But that salute, from a general no less, had spoken volumes. And when she returned it, calm and crisp, it wasn't just protocol. It was history, legacy, and respect all rolled into one quiet motion. And for Ethan, that one moment had split his world in two. Before Ghost Hawk, after Ghost Hawk. Nothing would ever be the same again. She had found the weak spot in the enemy's defenses. It was her strategy that allowed them to take down the outer perimeter without a sound. They moved like shadows across hostile ground, silent, unseen, every heartbeat synced with the next, relying solely on Ghost Hawk's calm voice in their ears to lead them through the dark. But perfection was a luxury war didn't offer. The enemy had been ready, more than anyone could have anticipated. Their extraction point was a trap, explosives wired into the grid, waiting. And when the ambush hit, it came fast and hard. Natalie made the call no one else had the courage to make. She stayed behind with 2 teammates, holding the line, creating just enough of a window for the rest of the team and the hostages to escape through a secondary route. Minutes bled into hours. The hills trembled with fire. And then nothing. Communications died, replaced by a wall of static that command could only listen to, helpless and blind. Hope dwindled in the silence. When the smoke finally cleared, the grid was gone. The hostages had survived. But Ghost Hawk, she had vanished. No body, no signal, just absence. She was listed as KAIE, another name added to a war few dared to speak of. There were medals written into files that collected dust, citations inked with praise no one would ever read. But the name Ghost Hawk lingered quietly, reverently, growing into legend. That legend had a face again today. She stood calmly in the hangar at Ravenfield Air Base, clipboard in hand, dressed in the plain coveralls of a maintenance officer. No medals, no announcements, just steady hands and focused eyes, doing the unglamorous work that kept jets ready to fly. The kind of work no one clapped for. The kind of service no one saw. Ethan stood frozen, his breath caught. Everything he'd ever assumed, mocked, came crashing down in one shattering moment of realization. The woman he'd made jokes about, the scars he'd laughed at behind her back. Those were the price of something he could never begin to grasp. She had walked into hell and bought time with blood and grit. And now, she wasn't basking in hero worship or wearing her story like a badge. She was here, doing the job, staying in the shadows, choosing silence. Natalie Cross didn't need the spotlight. She never had. She carried the weight of her choices with a quiet dignity. The world didn't know her story. She didn't need it to. The honors she'd earned meant nothing to her anymore. What mattered was that the jets flew, that missions were completed, and that others got to live because once she had stood in the fire without hesitation. Ethan had never felt smaller. The cocky bravado that once fueled his every word now seemed pathetic. The attention he used to chase felt meaningless beside the calm strength of the woman he'd misjudged so deeply. She was a hero, one of the real ones, and she never once asked to be treated like it. Some burdens are invisible. So are some heroes. And Natalie Cross was both. Ethan remained rooted where the general had left him, stiff at attention, even after Bradford's footsteps had long faded into the sprawling corridors of the base. Around him life resumed. Conversations slowly returned. Tools clinked against metal. The rhythmic pulse of the hangar crept back to life. But for Ethan, nothing would ever be the same. He felt emptied, stripped of every smug grin, every laugh that once echoed through the bay. In their place was a raw, searing truth. Ghost Hawk. The name echoed inside him, drowning out the applause he used to crave, louder than the taunts he'd made. She had been his target, his punchline, his joke. And all the while, she had been legendary, not through ego or noise, but through sacrifice, bravery, and silence. Ethan's stomach churned with shame. He had been so eager to be seen, to be admired. Now he saw clearly he had been a fool. A loud, ignorant fool who mocked what he didn't understand. A man who judged a hero by her scars, without knowing what it had cost to earn them. The rest of the day blurred. His hands performed his tasks, but his mind was stuck, playing back every careless word, every smirk, every disrespectful glance. He watched her now, differently. Natalie moved through the hangar with the same steady precision as always. Nothing in her had changed. But he had. By late afternoon, as golden light stretched winged shadows across the concrete, Ethan leaned against the barracks wall, trying to silence the chaos inside his chest. Long day. The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Claiborne, a man whose time in uniform exceeded that of most officers. His voice was rough, steady, seasoned by decades of things most people never lived through. Ethan paused, uncertainty flickering in his eyes before he gave a small nod. Yeah, long day. Claiborne stepped up beside him, arms folded across his chest, his eyes focused on the horizon where the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. You're not the first young airman to taste a slice of humble pie, Claiborne said after a quiet moment. And you won't be the last. Ethan let out a slow breath, unaware he'd been holding it in. I didn't know, he admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to know. I figured if I could make people laugh, maybe I wouldn't have to face what I didn't understand. Claiborne nodded like this wasn't the first time he'd heard such words, like it was a confession spoken many times before. That's the thing about arrogance, Ward. Most times it's just fear trying to look bigger by wearing a louder coat. The words struck Ethan like a punch to the chest, because deep down he knew they were true. His mockery hadn't come from cruelty, it had come from fear. Fear that Lieutenant Natalie Cross's quiet, steady presence made his need for noise look foolish. Fear that her calm capability exposed the cracks in his own. Fear that maybe he wasn't as clever or competent as the scores and certificates said he was. She doesn't act like she's anything special, Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the man beside him. Because she doesn't have to, Claiborne replied simply. Real strength doesn't need an audience. That night, Ethan lay in his bunk, staring at the metal ceiling above him. The weight of the day pressed on his chest like a storm cloud. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about Cross, the way she moved through the maintenance bay, efficient and focused, never seeking attention. The patience she showed younger techs, never condescending. The way she checked and double-checked every single detail, not for recognition, but because it mattered to her. And then he thought about himself, the cheap one-liners, the jokes that had always landed well enough to distract from his insecurity, his need for approval disguised as confidence, how often he'd tried to step over others just to feel like he stood taller. Humility, he was starting to understand, wasn't about putting yourself down. It was about being honest with yourself, about seeing all the parts, even the ones you didn't like. It was about being brave enough to admit when you were wrong. The next morning, Ethan approached the diagnostic station where Cross was working. His chest was tight and his palms a little damp, but he forced himself to speak with calm. Lieutenant, he began, voice low, measured with respect. I owe you an apology for what I said, for how I acted. I was out of line. Cross looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no fire behind her gaze. No anger, no judgment, just quiet recognition. Everyone makes mistakes, Ward, she said simply. It's what you do after that shows who you really are. Ethan gave a slow nod, and for the first time in days, something inside him began to loosen. And from that moment forward, everything shifted. He started to pay attention, not to how he was perceived, but to what needed to be done. He listened, he watched, he learned, he stopped competing for the spotlight. Instead, he worked to become the teammate others could count on, the airman he'd once pretended to be, a better version of the man he hoped he could become, because humility had taught him something that arrogance never had, that real strength isn't loud. It doesn't strut or demand attention. It just is. In the days and weeks that followed, Ethan Ward grew quieter. Not silent, but thoughtful, intentional. The need to fill every silence with a joke or story faded, like echoes from a version of himself that no longer fit. He started observing more than performing, absorbing everything around him like a student eager to grow. And at the center of it all remained Lieutenant Natalie Cross. She hadn't changed. She still moved through the maintenance bay with that same steady confidence, clipboard in hand, sharp eyes scanning every detail. She still rolled up her sleeves without hesitation, revealing the scars that had once made Ethan uneasy. But now, when he saw them, he didn't feel discomfort. He felt respect. Those scars weren't something to joke about. They weren't a punchline or a weakness. They were history etched into skin, proof of battles fought and survived, stories untold but deeply felt. And the more he watched her, the more it sank in. What struck Ethan most wasn't the things she'd endured or the quiet authority she carried. It was how completely ordinary she chose to remain. No showmanship, no grand declarations. She taught the greenest texts with a calm clarity that made everything seem manageable. She stayed late when others gave up, solving problems by sheer grit and knowledge. She ate in the mess with the rest of the crew, no airs, no entitlement, and Ethan finally understood. This wasn't just who she was. This was the life she had chosen. Natalie Cross, with all her strength and quiet brilliance, could have gone anywhere, commanded any office, chosen any post in the world. But she chose to be here. She chose the kind of work no one ever clapped for. The long shifts, the oil-streaked uniforms, the constant hum of machines replacing the sound of applause. Because true strength never begged for attention. It thrived in the background. It was in the way she quietly stepped in whenever something needed doing, never needing to be asked, in how she listened deeply, with intention, far more than she spoke, in the way her quiet presence seemed to elevate everyone around her, not by barking orders, but by being the kind of person others wanted to follow. The base began to shift because of it. People noticed, even the ones who had barely acknowledged her before started watching with a new respect in their eyes. Senior officers started showing up at the hangar more often. They'd give her a nod, a brief word of appreciation, never loud but meaningful. And the younger airmen, like Ethan, started to mirror her way of working, trying harder, keeping their workspaces cleaner, listening better. Ethan found himself drawn to her, not out of duty, but because there was something in her to learn from, something steady, grounded, unshakable. She never spoke about Iron Veil, never told stories about what she'd done or seen, but the truth was there, quietly present in the way she moved, in how she approached each task with calm purpose. The lessons were right there for anyone with the eyes and the humility to see them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Ravenfield's hangar in a soft golden haze, Ethan stood next to Master Sergeant Claiborne, both watching Natalie wrap up her shift. "She doesn't talk much," Ethan said softly. Claiborne nodded. "Doesn't need to. The ones who've been through hell usually don't." And Ethan understood, because real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shine in medals or live in speeches. It doesn't ask for recognition. It just is, quiet and constant. You find it in the hands that keep aircraft in the sky, in the eyes that know what needs doing and do it without waiting for thanks. You find it in people like Natalie Cross, people who carry heavy burdens in silence, and in doing so, lighten the load for everyone around them. There was a time I believed strength had to be loud, that it came with standing ovations, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, bold headlines. But Lieutenant Natalie Cross, Ghost Hawk, as some will always remember her, showed me something different, something deeper. That real strength speaks softly. It doesn't boast. It doesn't crave attention. It simply shows up when it's needed most, in the quiet hours, in the unseen moments, fixing what's broken, doing what's right, because it's right. Her scars, the ones I once made light of, aren't weaknesses. They're stories written in silence, testaments to battles fought so others wouldn't have to. They're reminders of the heavy cost paid for our safety, our freedom, our peace, and maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of strength we should be celebrating more often. In a world where noise often drowns out meaning, where fame is mistaken for value, perhaps we need to pause and look again at the people working in the background, the neighbor who checks in on the elderly each morning, the nurse who stays late because her patients matter, the veteran quietly helping out at the community center, asking for nothing in return. Maybe you've met someone like that, someone whose quiet strength left a mark on your life, someone whose visible or invisible scars carry the story of quiet sacrifice and unwavering service. If you have, I hope you'll share their story in the comments. Let's take a moment to honor the ones who never ask for praise but deeply deserve it. And here's something to consider. Who are the silent heroes walking among us right now? The ghost hawks of today, living in our neighborhoods, carrying unseen burdens, making quiet differences every day. Are we looking closely enough to notice them? Leave a comment below. Share your stories, your questions, your reflections. Let's start a conversation that matters. Because stories like this remind us of what's truly important. If this story touched your heart, if it opened your eyes to something real, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more honest, powerful stories of quiet heroism. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening with an open heart. The world needs more of that, more listening, more empathy, more gratitude for those who serve in silence.